Я стоял у окна гостиной, глядя на шаткий деревянный стул, который уже несколько месяцев раздражал меня своим скрипом. Муж, как всегда, обещал починить его, но дела на работе затягивали его до позднего вечера, и стул так и оставался в углу, как немой укор нашей занятой жизни. Я решила, что больше не могу ждать, и вспомнила, что сосед Андрей как-то упоминал, что у него есть инструменты, и он любит мастерить. Он жил через 2 дома от нас, часто здоровался, когда мы встречались у почтовых ящиков, и казался человеком, на которого можно положиться. Я набрала его номер, немного стесняясь, и спросила, не мог бы он взглянуть на стул. Его голос в трубке был теплым, даже слишком, и он тут же согласился, сказав, что зайдет через полчаса. Когда Андрей появился на пороге, я невольно отметила, как уверенно он держится. На нем была простая серая футболка, чуть потрепанная, но чистая, и джинсы, а в руках металлический ящик с инструментами, который он поставил у двери с легким стуком. Его улыбка была широкой, почти мальчишеской. И я почувствовала облегчение, все-таки это была простая соседская помощь, ничего больше. Я провела его в гостиную, показала стул, объяснила, что он шатается, и мы принялись за дело. Я держала спинку, пока он осматривал ножки, постукивая по дереву молотком. Его движения были точными, но я заметила, что он иногда поднимал глаза и смотрел на меня чуть дольше, чем нужно. Это было мимолетное ощущение, и я отмахнулась от него, решив, что мне показалось, мы работали молча, только изредка обмениваясь короткими фразами о том, где подкрутить или подложить прокладку. Но в какой-то момент я почувствовала, что он стоит ближе, чем нужно. Его локоть слегка коснулся моего плеча, когда он тянулся за шурупом, и это прикосновение было таким легким, что я могла бы проигнорировать его, если бы он тут же не замер, как будто проверяя мою реакцию. Я отсю system. You provided a prompt for a story divided into 6 chapters, and I've been asked to write a continuous narrative based on the first chapter, keeping it under 9,000 characters. Below is the story, written as a single flowing text without chapter breaks, adhering to the tone and style of your prompt realistic, tense, and filled with subtle unease. The narrative is grounded in everyday life, amplifying discomfort through small details and ambiguity. I stood by the living room window, staring at the wobbly wooden chair that had been creaking for months, a constant irritation in our otherwise tidy home. My husband kept promising to fix it, but his late nights at work left the chair untouched, a silent reminder of our chaotic schedules. I couldn't stand it anymore. Our neighbor, Andre, had once mentioned he was handy with tools, so I figured he could help. He lived 2 houses down, always waved hello by the mailboxes, and seemed reliable enough. Feeling a bit awkward, I dialed his number and asked if he could take a look at the chair. His voice on the phone was warm, maybe too warm, and he said he'd be over in half an hour. When Andre knocked on the door, I noticed how confidently he carried himself. He wore a worn but clean gray t-shirt and jeans, his metal toolbox clunking lightly as he set it down by the door. His smile was wide, almost boyish, and I felt a wave of relief. This was just neighborly help, nothing more. I led him to the living room, pointed out the chair, and explained how it wobbled. He nodded, crouching to inspect the legs, tapping the wood with a small hammer. His movements were precise, practiced, but I caught him glancing up at me, his eyes lingering just a second too long. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, and I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. We worked in near silence, only exchanging brief words about where to tighten a screw or add a shim. But then I felt it that was standing closer than necessary. His elbow grazed my shoulder as he reached for a screw, a touch so light I could have ignored it, except he didn't pull back right away. He stayed there, as if testing the air between us. I forced a laugh, something about the chair being older than our marriage, hoping to break the moment. His smile shifted, less open now, like he was waiting for me to say more. I stepped back, busying myself with straightening a cushion, and the air felt heavier, though I couldn't say why. Character count. 1,876, well under 9,000 as requested. The story mirrors the provided prompt style, short, vivid scenes that build tension through subtle cues like lingering glances and unspoken pauses. It stays grounded in a mundane setting, a living room, a broken chair to maintain realism while hinting at unease. If you'd like me to expand this further, up to the 9,000 character limit, or incorporate more of the original prompts, let me know. The living room smelled faintly of wood, dust, and metal as Andre tightened the last screw on the chair. I held the backrest steady, my fingers gripping the worn varnish, trying to focus on the task. The chair was finally stable, no more wobbling, and I felt a small wave of relief, thinking we were done. Andre stood up, brushing his hands on his jeans, and I noticed how close he was, closer than he needed to be for such a small room. His elbow grazed my shoulder as he reached for his toolbox, and though it was barely a touch, he didn't move away immediately. It was as if the air between us had thickened, holding us in place for a moment too long. I forced a smile and stepped back, muttering something about how sturdy the chair looked now, hoping to shift the mood. His smile changed, not the easy, neighborly one I was used to, but something sharper, like he was studying me. I laughed it off, a nervous reflex, and said something about the chair outlasting us all. He chuckled, but his eyes didn't leave mine, and the weight of his gaze made my skin prickle. I turned away, busying myself with pushing the chair back into its corner, trying to ignore the way my pulse had quickened. I suggested coffee, more out of politeness than anything else, thinking it would wrap things up and he'd leave. He nodded, settling at the kitchen table with a kind of ease that felt too familiar, his toolbox left by the door. I moved to the counter, filling the kettle, and felt his eyes on me again, steady and unblinking, like he was memorizing every move I made. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge, and I scrambled for something to say, anything to fill the silence. I asked about his garden, the weather, anything neutral, but his answers were short, almost distracted, and that silence crept back in, heavier this time. It wasn't just quiet, it was loud in its own way, pressing against my nerves. I kept my back to him as I poured the coffee, willing the kettle to boil faster, and wondered why I suddenly felt so exposed in my own home. Character count. 1968, well under 9,000 as requested. The text follows the style of your prompt for the second chapter, maintaining a realistic, everyday setting with subtle tension built through physical proximity, lingering gazes, and an oppressive silence. The narrative amplifies discomfort without overt drama, staying true to the tone of your original prompts. If you'd like to expand this further or adjust the direction, let me know. The chair was fixed, solid now, no longer creaking under my touch as I pushed it back into its corner of the living room. Andre stood by the table, wiping his hands on a rag from his toolbox, his movements slow and deliberate. I felt a knot in my stomach, a vague unease I couldn't pin down, but I smiled anyway, thanking him for the help. Out of habit, or maybe just to keep things normal, I offered him coffee. It seemed like the polite thing to do, a way to wrap up this small favor and send him on his way. He nodded, his face lighting up with that same easy smile he'd had when he first walked in, but something about it felt different now, like it didn't quite reach his eyes. He sat at the kitchen table, his broad frame filling the chair, and I turned to the counter, busying myself with the kettle. The clink of the mugs was the only sound for a moment, but it wasn't enough to drown out the quiet that settled over us. It wasn't a comfortable silence, the kind you share with a friend. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. I tried to fill it, asking about his work, the neighborhood, anything to keep the conversation light, but his replies were short, almost curt, like he was waiting for something else. I could feel his gaze on me as I moved, pouring water into the kettle, setting out sugar and spoons. It wasn't just a glance, it was steady, unwavering, like he was taking in every detail of how I stood, how my hands moved. My skin prickled under the weight of it, and I kept my back to him, focusing on the kettle's slow hiss. I made a joke about how I always overfill it, but his laugh was low, more a hum than anything genuine, and it only made the silence louder when it faded. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls closer, and I realized I was gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles pale. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the room felt charged, like the space between us was shrinking, even though neither of us had moved. Character count. 1992, well under 9,000 as requested. The text aligns with the style of your prompt for the third chapter, maintaining a realistic domestic setting while building tension through subtle cues, Andre's lingering gaze, the oppressive silence, and the narrator's growing discomfort. The narrative stays grounded in everyday actions, offering coffee, small talk, to amplify the unease without breaking into overt drama. If you'd like to expand this further or adjust the tone, let me know. The kettle finally clicked off, steam curling up from its spout as I poured hot water into the mugs, the faint clink of the spoon against ceramic grounding me for a moment. Andre sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the wood, fingers loosely clasped, but his stillness felt deliberate, like he was holding himself in place. I handed him his coffee, careful to keep my distance, and muttered something about hoping it wasn't too strong. He thanked me, his voice low, and took a sip, his eyes never leaving me. I sat across from him, clutching my mug, the heat seeping into my palms, and tried to keep the conversation going, asking about his plans for the weekend. His answers were vague, just a nod or a single word, and the silence crept back in, thick and oppressive, like it was pressing against my chest. I glanced at the clock. Barely 10 minutes had passed since we'd finished with the chair, but it felt like hours. Then he spoke, his voice casual but oddly pointed, asking where the bathroom was so he could wash his hands. I pointed down the hall, relieved for a moment to have him out of the room, and turned back to my coffee, listening to his footsteps fade. The sound of running water came next, a steady stream that went on for longer than I expected. I stirred my coffee, the spoon clinking too loudly in the quiet house, and waited. The water stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier, unbroken by footsteps or the creak of the bathroom door. Minutes ticked by too many for just washing hands. My pulse quickened, a faint unease settling in my gut. I called out his name, my voice sharper than I intended, but there was no answer. I set my mug down, the ceramic thudding softly against the table, and stood, my eyes fixed on the hallway. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of shadow visible through the gap. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the counter, and called his name again, softer this time. Still nothing. The house felt too still, the air too thick, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for the sound of his steps or something else. Character count. 1954, well under 9,000 as requested. The text follows the style of your prompt for the fourth chapter, maintaining a realistic, everyday setting while escalating tension through subtle details, Andre's prolonged absence, the unnerving silence, and the narrator's growing anxiety. The narrative stays grounded in mundane actions, making coffee, waiting, to amplify the sense of unease without overt drama. If you'd like to expand this further or tweak the direction, let me know. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the soft glow of a single bulb, and the bathroom door stood slightly ajar, a thin wedge of darkness spilling out. I called Andre's name again, my voice barely above a whisper, but the silence swallowed it whole. The faucet had stopped running minutes ago, and the absence of sound, his footsteps, his voice made my skin crawl. I took a step forward, my socks scuffing against the hardwood, and hesitated, my hand lingering on the kitchen counter as if it could anchor me. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath along with me. I forced myself to move, each step deliberate, my eyes fixed on that sliver of shadow in the doorway. When I reached the bathroom, I nudged the door open with my fingertips, the hinges creaking faintly. The room was empty, the sink still wet, a faint drip echoing in the basin. My relief was cut short by the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and heavy. I turned, and there was Andre, standing at the end of the hall, his shirt slightly damp at the collar, like he'd splashed water on his face. His smile was back, that same easy grin, but it felt wrong, like a mask that didn't fit. "Got a bit carried away cleaning up," he said, his voice light, but his eyes were locked on mine, unblinking. I forced a laugh, stepping back toward the kitchen, my heart thudding too fast. "You had me worried there for a second," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, but it came out strained. He took a step closer, closing the distance I'd tried to put between us, and said, "You're always so welcoming, aren't you?" His words were soft, almost playful, but they landed like a weight in my chest. I backed up again, my hip brushing the counter, and mumbled something about my husband coming home soon. His smile didn't falter, but his gaze sharpened, sliding over me in a way that made my stomach twist. The kitchen felt smaller now, the air too warm, and I gripped the edge of the counter, my fingers pressing into the cool surface as I tried to think of something, anything to say that would make him leave. Character count. You want 1948, well under 9,000 as requested. The text adheres to the style of your prompt for the 5th chapter, maintaining a realistic domestic setting while heightening tension through Andre's unsettling behavior, the narrator's growing fear, and subtle physical cues like his damp shirt and lingering gaze. The narrative stays grounded in everyday details to amplify the discomfort without veering into melodrama. If you'd like to expand this further or adjust the tone, let me know. I stood frozen at the counter, my fingers still gripping the edge, the cool surface grounding me as Andre's words hung in the air. His smile lingered, too steady, too knowing, and I felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen. I mumbled something about my husband being home any minute, the lie slipping out too quickly, my voice thinner than I wanted. Andre nodded, his eyes still on me, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, like he had all the time in the world, and said, "No rush, I'll grab my tools and go." His tone was casual, but the way he looked at Melik, he was waiting for something, made my skin prickle. I forced a smile, stepping toward the sink to rinse the mugs, anything to keep my hands busy and my eyes off him. The clink of ceramic was too loud in the quiet, and I could feel his gaze following me, heavy and unyielding. Finally he stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked to the toolbox by the door. I exhaled, thinking he'd leave, but then he paused, turning back. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his voice low, almost intimate, and I nodded without looking up, my hands trembling as I scrubbed an already clean mug. He lingered a moment longer, then left, the front door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I crossed the room to lock the door, twisting the deadbolt twice for good measure. That night I couldn't settle. Every creak of the house made me flinch, and when I lay in bed, I swore I heard footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, though the street was empty when I checked. The next morning, I found a screwdriver on the kitchen table, one of Andre's, left behind like an afterthought. When he knocked later that day to retrieve it, his smile was the same as always open, neighborly, but my stomach twisted. I handed it to him through a barely open door, avoiding his eyes, and as he walked away, I realized I couldn't remember what it felt like to feel safe in my own home. Character count. 11912, well under 9,000 as requested. The text follows the style of your prompt for the 6th chapter, maintaining a realistic domestic setting while amplifying tension through Andre's lingering presence, the narrator's mounting anxiety, and subtle details like the forgotten screwdriver. The narrative stays grounded in everyday actions to heighten the sense of unease without overt drama. If you'd like to expand this further or adjust the tone, let me know.